Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Friday, August 23rd, 2024. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell signals the Fed is prepared to start cutting interest rates, telling the annual Fed Economic Conference at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, the upside risks to inflation have diminished and the downside risks to employment have increased. The time has come for policy to adjust. Justice Department files an antitrust lawsuit against the real estate software company RealPage, charging that the software allowed landlords to collude to keep rents high. Independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. suspends his campaign and endorses Republican nominee Donald Trump, saying he doesn't want to be a spoiler and hand the victory to Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris. Kennedy spent much of his speech in Arizona today criticizing the Democratic Party and mainstream media for, he says, unfairly hindering his run for the White House. And White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby says ceasefire and hostage release talks involving Israel and Hamas will continue into the weekend. This comes after reports that an agreement was near collapse. Story from USA Today, noting that inflation is easing while the job market is weakening. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell provided the strongest signal yet Friday that the central bank plans to begin cutting historically high interest rates in September. He gave no clues on how much the Fed would lower its key rate, but most forecasters expect a quarter-point reduction. He said, "My confidence has grown that inflation is on a sustainable path back to 2%, which is the Fed's inflation goal." Fed rate cuts would lower borrowing costs for mortgages, credit cards, and other consumer and business loans, while likely juicing the stock market. It would also reduce bank saving account yields that finally have been generating healthy returns. That article from USA Today. Fed Chair Powell spoke at the annual conference at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, hosted by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. He spent the first 4 minutes summarizing the state of inflation, the labor market, and interest rates.
For much of the past 3 years, inflation ran well above our 2% goal, and labor market conditions were extremely tight. The FOMC's primary focus has been on bringing down inflation, and appropriately so. Prior to this episode, most Americans alive today had not experienced the pain of high inflation for a sustained period. Inflation brought substantial hardship, especially for those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials, like food, housing, and transportation. High inflation triggered stress and a sense of unfairness that linger today. Our restrictive monetary policy helped restore balance between aggregate supply and demand, easing inflationary pressures and ensuring that inflation expectations remained well anchored. Inflation is now much closer to our objective, with prices having risen 2.5% over the past 12 months. After a pause earlier this year, progress toward our 2% objective has resumed. My confidence has grown that inflation is on a sustainable path back to 2%. Turning to employment, in the years just prior to the pandemic, we saw the significant benefits to society that can come from a long period of strong labor market conditions. Low unemployment, high participation, historically low racial employment gaps, and with inflation low and stable, healthy real wage gains that were increasingly concentrated among those with lower incomes. Today, the labor market has cooled considerably from its formerly overheated state. The unemployment rate began to rise over a year ago and is now at 4.3%, still low by historical standards, but almost a full percentage point above its level in early 2023. Most of that increase has come over the past 6 months. So far, rising unemployment has not been the result of elevated layoffs, as is typically the case in an economic downturn. Rather, the increase mainly reflects a substantial increase in the supply of workers and a slowdown from the previously frantic pace of hiring. Even so, the cooling in labor market conditions is unmistakable. Job gains remain solid, but have slowed this year. Job vacancies have fallen, and the ratio of vacancies to unemployment has returned to its pre-pandemic range. The hiring and quits rates are now below the levels that prevailed in 2018 and 19. Nominal wage gains have moderated, and all told, labor market conditions are now less tight than just before the pandemic in 2019, a year when inflation ran below 2%. it seems unlikely that the labor market will be a source of elevated inflationary pressures anytime soon. We do not seek or welcome further cooling in labor market conditions. Overall, the economy continues to grow at a solid pace, but the inflation and labor market data show an evolving situation. The upside risks to inflation have diminished, and the downside risks to employment have increased. As we highlighted in our last FOMC statement, we are attentive to the risks to both sides of our dual mandate. The time has come for policy to adjust. The direction of travel is clear, and the timing and pace of rate cuts will depend on incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. We will do everything we can to support a strong labor market as we make further progress toward price stability. With an appropriate dialing back of policy restraint, there is good reason to think that the economy will get back to 2% inflation while maintaining a strong labor market. The current level of our policy rate gives us ample room to respond to any risks we may face, including the risk of unwelcome further weakening in labor market conditions.
The Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, at the annual Economic Symposium hosted by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. The next Federal Reserve meeting where interest rates could be cut is September 17th and 18th. The Fed raised interest rates 11 times between March 2022 and July 2023. In reaction on Wall Street to the Fed chair's speech, the Dow up 462, NASDAQ up 258, S&P up 63. And now to the presidential race. NBC News reports that Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s campaign told a Pennsylvania court that he will be endorsing former President Donald Trump ahead of his own Friday afternoon announcement, putting to rest a tumultuous independent presidential campaign. The filing in Pennsylvania in a lawsuit related to a legal challenge to his own ballot access in the state said that Kennedy was withdrawing from the ballot as a result of today's endorsement of Donald Trump for the office of President of the United States. The filing came shortly before Kennedy took the stage at an Arizona press conference where he announced the end of his presidential campaign. Trump has his own event in nearby Glendale later Friday where Kennedy will speak, according to three sources familiar with the planning. Kennedy opened his remarks Friday blasting the Democratic Party for abandoning democracy, lambasting his naysayers for not believing his campaign could be successful, and accusing both the media and Democrats of a conspiracy that kept him from being competitive. Then Kennedy made it official. That was the article from NBC News. Here's where it picks up in his speech.
In my heart, I no longer believe that I have a realistic path to electoral victory in the face of this relentless systematic censorship and media control. So I cannot in good conscience ask my staff and volunteers to keep working their long hours or ask my donors to keep giving when I cannot honestly tell them that I have a real path to the White House. Furthermore, our polling consistently showed that by staying on the ballot in the battleground states, I would likely hand the election over to the Democrats with whom I disagree on the most existential issues: censorship, war, and chronic disease. I want everyone to know that I am not terminating my campaign. I am simply suspending it and not ending it. My name will remain on the ballot in most states. If you live in a blue state, you can vote for me without harming or helping President Trump or Vice President Harris. In red states, the same will apply. I encourage you to vote for me. And if enough of you do vote for me, and neither of the major party candidates win 270 votes, which is quite possible, in fact, today our polling shows them tying at 269 to 269, and I could conceivably still end up in the White House in a contingent election. But in about 10 battleground states where my presence would be a spoiler, I'm going to remove my name, and I've already started that process and urge voters not to vote for me. It's with a sense of victory and not defeat that I'm suspending my campaign activities. Not only did we do the impossible by collecting 1 million signatures, we changed the national political conversation forever. Chronic disease, free speech, government corruption, breaking our addiction to war have moved to the center of politics. I can say to all who have worked so hard in the last year and a half, thank you for a job well done. Three great causes drove me to enter this race in the first place, primarily. And these are the principal causes that persuaded me to leave the Democratic Party and run as an independent, and now to throw my support to President Trump. The causes were free speech, the war in Ukraine, and the war on our children.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr., now former independent presidential candidate in Phoenix. And former President Donald Trump, Republican presidential nominee, reacted to the news of the endorsement at a rally in Las Vegas.
We just had a very nice endorsement from RFK Jr., Bobby. And I'll be talking about that. We're heading out right after this. We're going to be going to Arizona. We'll be talking about that and a lot of other things, too. But I just want to thank everybody. And I want to thank Bobby. That was very nice. That was really very nice. That's big. He's a great guy, respected by everybody.
Former President Donald Trump, Republican presidential nominee in Las Vegas. The rally he mentioned in Arizona is in Glendale, and he and Robert F. Kennedy Jr. expected to appear together. Story from the Independent newspaper. Just before President Biden dropped out, RFK Jr. had been polling between 8.5% to 10% of the national vote. Since July 21st, however, he has been hovering just around 5% of the vote, and that number seems to be going down. So what happened? This dip may partly be explained by the fact that voters often turn to third-party candidates for lack of a better option, and because they want a fresh face. By replacing Biden with Kamala Harris, some of those cries for change were answered. That was from the Independent newspaper. Donald Trump today spoke at the Il Toro y la Capra Mexican and Italian fusion restaurant in Las Vegas about one of his policy proposals, not taxing income from tips. A significant percentage of Nevada's workforce is in the hospitality industry and gets tips, and Nevada is a battleground state this year. Donald Trump also mentions the speech by Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris last night at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
If you're a restaurant worker, a bartender, a hospitality worker, a caddy, a barber, a mover, a driver of any kind, or anyone else, you rely on a lot of tip income, hopefully a lot. But when I win in November, hopefully we're going to win. We're going to turn our country around. We're going to make America great again. We're going to let you keep 100% of your tip income and not be harassed. And just so you understand, the other side, Kamala, have you ever heard of her? Kamala? Nobody ever heard of her before. She lost in the first round. She was the first one out. It's a weird thing. He got 14 million votes, and he's sitting on a beach angry as hell. And she got no votes, and she's running. So you explained that to me. But the United States is home to an estimated 5.5 million workers whose livelihoods depend on tip income. And they work with their hands and their talent, their sweat and their skill, and they are really skilled people, and they're great people. They're people that have been with me always, and I'm with them. I'm doing them a big favor. Nobody ever heard of this concept before, and it's something that makes a lot of sense. As soon as I heard it, I said, let's do it. And then they copied us a couple of months later, but I don't think anybody's buying it. I don't think anybody's buying it. It's like last night, the speech. She made 26 different things that were lies. She lied, but that's okay because a lot of people lie. They'll do anything to get elected, but she lied about, she's increasing taxes, I'm decreasing taxes, and she put it the other way around. Perhaps she misspoke, perhaps. Nearly 2/3 of the workers are women, and an estimated 700,000 single mothers nationwide rely on tip income to support their children. These are some of the best and hardest working people in America, and when I'm president, you are the ones I will be fighting for, and I'll be fighting for you very hard every single day.
Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump at a restaurant in Las Vegas. Associated Press reporting from Chicago, Kamala Harris summoned Americans on Thursday to reject political division and instead chart what she called a new way forward as she accepted her party's nomination while blending biography with warnings about electing Donald Trump again to the White House, taking the stage to a thunderous standing ovation. As she closed out the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, the vice president argued that her personal story and background as a prosecutor made her uniquely qualified to protect Americans' interests against a former president she cast as only having his own interests in mind. That's the story from Associated Press. Here are the last 3 minutes of Kamala Harris's speech Thursday night at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago.
My mother had another lesson she used to teach. Never let anyone tell you who you are. You show them who you are. America, let us show each other and the world who we are and what we stand for. Freedom, opportunity, compassion, dignity, fairness, and endless possibilities. We are the heirs to the greatest democracy in the history of the world. And on behalf of our children and our grandchildren and all those who sacrificed so dearly for our freedom and liberty, we must be worthy of this moment. It is now our turn to do what generations before us have done, guided by optimism and faith, to fight for this country we love, to fight for the ideals we cherish, and to uphold the awesome responsibility that comes with the greatest privilege on earth, the privilege and pride of being an American. Chapter in the most extraordinary story ever told. Thank you. God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you all.
Vice President Kamala Harris, the Democratic presidential nominee, capping her speech Thursday night at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Story from Mediaite. According to Fox Sports' president of Insights and Analytics, Vice President Kamala Harris's acceptance speech drew 22% more viewers than former President Donald Trump's speech. Mike Mulvihill shared via social media that Harris's speech, which started at 10:30 Eastern and ran to 11:15 Eastern, saw a 15.0, while Trump's speech in late July, which also started roughly at 10:30 Eastern and ran through to midnight, pulled a 12.3 number. Mulvihill appears to be referencing early Nielsen numbers. That was from Mediaite. And a story from AP, 8 times over the past 16 presidential election cycles, dating back to 1960, the party with the most popular convention among television viewers won in November. 8 times they lost. Through the first 3 nights of each convention this summer, the Democrats averaged 20.6 million viewers. The Nielsen Company said Republicans averaged 17 million in July. This is Washington Today. U.S. Secret Service, writes CBS, has placed at least 5 agents on leave, including the head of the Pittsburgh field office, as a result of its investigation into last month's assassination attempt against former President Donald Trump, according to multiple sources familiar with the matter. 1 agent on Trump's detail and 3 others in the Pittsburgh office were among those placed on leave, according to 2 federal law enforcement sources. It's unclear if all of these actions are disciplinary, since agents are routinely placed on leave during the course of investigations for various reasons, including mental health relief. That from CBS News. Republican Congressman Chip Roy of Texas spoke about this today on Fox News.
We're now 41 days removed from the former president of the United States and the current frontrunner and the now nominee for the Republican Party nomination who got shot. It wasn't just an attempt. He was literally shot, and it's by the grace of God that it wasn't a life-threatening wound. And now what we find out is that the very same Secret Service that was immediately pointing their fingers at local law enforcement, they now have 5 of their guys, I think it's 5, whatever this number that today announced, that are on leave after getting rid of Cheadle. But the fact is, you had local law enforcement, as we've seen from now the body cam footage, who were the ones saying, gosh, we told those guys, expletive deleted from their quote. We told those guys to post some guys up there on the roof, to post guys in the right place. We now know that we had Crooks, who was able to have a drone flying literally within 200 feet of the podium the same day that President Trump was there. They didn't post anybody on the water tower. They didn't post anybody up on the rooftops where they needed to be. They didn't have their own drones flying. They didn't have answers when local law enforcement said, hey, we got a guy here with a rangefinder and he looks suspicious, and they didn't do anything about it. So this is why a few of us are going to have our own hearing on Monday in Washington with 2 former snipers, Corey Mills, Eli Crane, who was obviously in the Navy SEALs, 2 great Americans, a few of us, Andy Biggs, myself, Matt Gaetz, and we're going to have Dan Bongino, Eric Prince, and one of the counter snipers from Butler. We're going to do that hearing on Monday to try to get to the bottom of it, running in parallel with Mike Johnson's task force with our good friends Clay Higgins and Mark Green on it.
Congressman Chip Roy, Republican from Texas, on Fox News. Senator Josh Hawley, Republican from Missouri, posting today on X, whistleblower says Secret Service headquarters told agents working the Butler, Pennsylvania event not to request additional manpower resources for the rally and warned any such requests would be denied. Contradicts Director Rowe testimony, who said no resources were ever denied. Senator Hawley attached a copy of the letter he sent to the Secret Service Director Ronald Rowe with some questions he wants answered about this. An Axios story from about a week ago reads that Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco recused herself from the special counsel's investigation into President Biden's handling of classified materials last year, 3 people close to the White House told Axios. The reason for the recusal remains unclear. But after Special Counsel Robert Hur's investigation concluded, Monaco conveyed to the White House Chief of Staff's office that she would have handled the controversial probe differently, one of the sources told Axios. Hur declined to press charges against President Biden, in part, he wrote, because a jury would see Biden as a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. Part of the article from Axios. Today, Attorney General Merrick Garland and Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco were asked about this.
There's a report recently, just the last few days, about the Deputy Attorney General reaching out to White House officials to say that she would have handled the investigation into the president's handling of classified documents differently from the way you handled it. And I wondered whether you were the Deputy Attorney General would like to address that and whether that's true.
Let me begin. Lisa and I have worked together now for many years. She's been an enormously successful counsel to me on this, and we have seen eye to eye really on everything. She's told me that she's never said anything like this to anyone, and of course I believe her. But Lisa, if you want to speak some more.
Statement was issued on this, and while we don't comment on recusals, it would be completely inappropriate to do so. Got nothing to add to the statement, and of course, I don't disagree with the Attorney General with what he just said.
Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco and Attorney General Merrick Garland answering reporters' questions at a news conference in Washington. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Hi, I'm Susan Swain. Campaign 2024 has evolved in some unexpected ways. And from now until Election Day, C-SPAN promises you unfiltered coverage of the candidates as they battle to win the White House and Congress. You may not know that C-SPAN is a private company that operates without a dime of government money. And like many media organizations, we've been impacted by cord cutting. This summer, we are asking for you to help support our unbiased political coverage with a donation. Here's the good news. 100% of your contribution, large or small, directly supports C-SPAN operations. And best of all, an anonymous donor has pledged to match your donation dollar for dollar. You can find out more at cspan.org/donate. Help ensure that C-SPAN's unique, long-form coverage of politics is here to stay. Visit cspan.org/donate. Thank you for watching, and thanks so much for your support.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast wherever you find your podcasts and on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app. Washington Post writes the Justice Department and attorneys general from 8 states are suing a Texas-based software company accused of using complex algorithms to enable widespread collusion in rents by landlords. In a lawsuit filed Friday in the Middle District of North Carolina, federal regulators accused RealPage of an unlawful scheme to decrease competition in apartment rentals and abusing monopoly power in its niche market for software that landlords use to price apartments. That was from Washington Post. Attorney General Merrick Garland was at a news conference at the Justice Department in Washington, D.C.
RealPage sells landlords what it calls, quote, revenue management software. We allege that this software is developed, marketed, and sold to enable landlords to sidestep vigorous competition in the rental market. Competing landlords agree to submit to RealPage on a daily basis their most sensitive, non-public information, including rental rates, lease terms, and projected vacancies. RealPage then combines this data from competing landlords and feeds it into an algorithm that provides real-time pricing recommendations back to the competing landlords. But as we allege, these are more than just recommendations. RealPage actively polices landlords' compliance with those recommendations. It also monitors landlords' other policies by, for example, trying to stop concessions that landlords use to attract or retain renters. A large number of landlords effectively agree to outsource their pricing decisions to RealPage by using a, quote, auto-accept setting, which effectively permits RealPage to determine the price a renter will pay. Landlords understand what their arrangement with RealPage gets them. As one said, quote, I always liked this product because your algorithm uses proprietary data from other subscribers to suggest rents and terms. That's classic price fixing, close quote. And RealPage understands what it's doing too. In advertising its service to landlords, RealPage frequently says that a, quote, rising tide raises all ships. As a RealPage vice president explained, this phrase means that, quote, there is greater good in everybody succeeding versus essentially trying to compete against one another. But essentially trying to compete against one another is what our free market economy is all about. And ensuring such competition is what our antitrust laws are all about. Americans spend more money on housing than any other expense. Tens of millions of Americans are renters, and almost half of those households spend close to a third of their hard-earned income on rent. Under the antitrust laws, landlords, like any other competitors, may not share with each other their confidential, sensitive data in a way that permits them to align how they price their products, in this case apartments, and thus cause renters to pay more than they would in a competitive market. Using software as a sharing mechanism or calling it, quote, artificial intelligence revenue management, close quote, as RealPage does not immunize the scheme from Sherman Act liability.
Attorney General Merrick Garland at a news conference today at the Justice Department in Washington. A Bloomberg article about this lawsuit says that RealPage said it is following the law and has worked with the Justice Department to remain in compliance. The company said in a statement, RealPage's revenue management software is purposely built to be legally compliant, and we have a history of working constructively with the Justice Department to show that. Bloomberg article also has this paragraph. In a June statement, RealPage said its software uses anonymous data in an aggregated fashion, and landlords don't have insight into competitors' pricing. The company said the software only suggests rental prices, and its customers accept those recommendations less than 50% of the time. From Reuters, the union representing workers at Canadian National Railway said on Friday they would strike next week in a fresh threat to the economy after vowing to challenge a government decision to end an unprecedented rail stoppage. The Teamsters Union filed notice that conductors, locomotive engineers, and other workers at Montreal-based CN would strike on Monday, just days after returning to work on Friday. That was from Reuters. The Teamsters Canada National President Francois Laporte spoke to reporters in Calgary, Alberta.
It's a work stoppage, and obviously it's going to have impact on the economy. But I want people to realize and understand that the Canadian Industrial Labour Board issued a decision 2 weeks ago that this is not essential services and there is no emergency. And this is why we were surprised with the minister's decision yesterday, because 2 weeks ago he said, well, no arbitration and no back to work. And then suddenly, within a couple of days, he's probably under pressure from the Chamber of Commerce, from the association everywhere, that he was pressed, and he got the pressure, and he made that decision suddenly that, okay, guys, we have to force you back to work. And as far as we are concerned, this is not acceptable. The best way to have a contract is at the bargaining table. We don't believe to let a third party to decide what's going to be our working condition. We know the railway operation are very complicated. The union knows the operation. The companies knows the operation, and they know what we need to operate this and to provide the workers a decent working condition. So we believe in fair and honest bargaining, and that's what we want. We want a fair and honest bargaining with the company.
Teamsters Canada National President Francois Laporte speaking to reporters in Calgary. From a USA Today article, the Canadian and U.S. economies are highly integrated. Rail transport accounted for 14% of total bilateral trade of $382.4 billion between the countries for the first half of the year, according to the U.S. Department of Transportation. This is Washington Today. White House National Security spokesman John Kirby writes Associated Press said Friday that ceasefire talks in Cairo have been constructive and will continue over the weekend. Kirby pushed back against reports that negotiators are near collapse as Hamas and Israel have major differences over Israel's insistence that it maintain forces in two strategic corridors in Gaza. CIA Director William Burns and Brett McGurk, a senior advisor on the Middle East to President Joe Biden, are leading the U.S. side of negotiations. That article from Associated Press. John Kirby spoke to reporters in an online audio news conference.
Could you just give us an update on Brett's meetings in Cairo and how they're going and where things stand? And then related to that, is there plans for some sort of, high-level summit led by Director Burns in the region on Sunday?
I think all of that's kind of mixed in together with your first question, Amr. They had constructive discussions last night in Cairo, and those discussions are going to continue today. Director Burns is there today to join those discussions. So the process is actually moving forward. It's moving forward in the way we had outlined earlier in terms of these next rounds of talks. Now, what's critical is that that everybody participate in these talks, and that the sides continue to work towards implementation. That everybody comes to these discussions with an eye towards actually closing out these implementation details and getting after it. And so again, early signs in Cairo, and these are early signs, is that the discussions have been constructive, but there's more talks to come here over the course of the weekend. As I said, Director Burns is there, Brett McGurk is there, and so we'll be staying in touch with them, of course, over the next couple of days and seeing how things shake out. But things are moving forward. There's been press reporting out there that they're near collapse. That is not accurate. There has been progress made. We need now for both sides to come together and work towards implementation.
White House Strategic Communications Coordinator John Kirby in an online audio news conference. New York Times reporting later in the day, mediators aim to move ahead with the summit next week to advance a ceasefire agreement in Gaza, Israeli officials said on Friday, after Israeli security chiefs sought to obtain Egyptian consent for a post-war Israeli presence along Gaza's border with Egypt. The issue has emerged as a particularly contentious dispute in the overall negotiation for a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. Talks that mediators from Egypt, Qatar, and the United States have struggled for months to keep alive. That was from the New York Times. Stefan Dujarric is a spokesperson for the United Nations Secretary General. He gave an update today at a news conference at the UN in New York City on the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
Our colleagues at the World Health Organization are warning that disrupted water and sanitation systems in Gaza, including at hospitals, are increasing the risk of infectious diseases. WHO has procured more than $400,000 worth of infection prevention and control supplies, including chlorine tablets, hygiene products, and gloves. These items have already been delivered to 5 hospitals, with plans to reach 2 others in the coming weeks. However, we keep sounding the alarm that repeated evacuation orders continue to severely disrupt aid operations in Gaza. Meanwhile, our partners said the amount of food assistance that has entered southern Gaza in July was one of the lowest recorded in the last 10 months. They warned that active hostilities, damaged roads, access constraints, and a lack of public order and safety have led to critical food shortages. Children are paying the heaviest price, with poor diet and the decimation of healthcare services and water, sanitation, and hygiene infrastructure, raising the risks of malnutrition and disease. Our partners are working to provide nutrition. Those of our partners who are working on the nutrition issues say the number of children in northern Gaza who were diagnosed with acute malnutrition soared by over 300% last month as compared to May, and by more than 150% in the south of the Gaza Strip. Without unfettered humanitarian access that allows major scale-up of support, hunger and malnutrition will only worsen. Those hot meals reached an estimated, World Food Program tells us that as of a week ago, the agency had reached some 370,000 people with partial food parcels and wheat flour this month. However, distribution in Rafah is unfortunately rare due to the ongoing fighting. WFP also distributed 4.4 million hot meals across Gaza so far this month, and that was done through about 60 community kitchens. Those meals reached an estimated 78,000 people, most of them in Khan Yunis and Deir al-Balah area.
Stefan Dujarric is a spokesperson for the United Nations Secretary General, part of his news conference today at the UN in New York City. Back to the White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby and his online audio briefing. He also answered reporters' questions about the war between Russia and Ukraine. A Political Europe article reads that President Vladimir Putin has a message for the Russian region where Ukraine has seized more than 1,000 square kilometers of territory. Don't blame me. Speaking via video conference to a meeting of Russian politicians, including the governors of Kursk, Belgorod, and Bryansk regions, Putin said the security issues that had arisen in Kursk were problems that are the responsibility of the security forces. He added that Moscow would work with local and regional authorities and security agencies to play a positive role in achieving the goals that we have here. That was from Politico Europe. Here's a question to the White House spokesperson, John Kirby.
I want to ask about remarks that President Zelensky made earlier this week, which he said that the Kursk incursion showed that concerns about red lines had been illusory and that there was a philosophical shift taking place amongst Ukraine's Western allies. Do you think that the Kursk incursion has changed any of your thinking about escalation risks or so-called Russian red lines?
We've been watching escalation risks since the beginning of this conflict, and that ain't going to change. We're always going to be concerned about the potential for the aggression in Ukraine to lead to escalation on the European continent. And that's something that we've been watching again since the beginning, and we still do. And I think it's too soon to know right now about what's going on in Kursk as to, what that looks like. I'll tell you, the Russians have flowed some resources to that area to try to thwart what the Ukrainians are doing. And so how effective that's going to be, what the outcome of that's going to be, we don't know yet. And therefore, it's too soon to know whether what's going on in Kursk is with a potential impact that could have in terms of escalation. But it is something that we remain concerned about.
White House National Security Communications Advisor John Kirby in an online audio press conference. President Joe Biden putting out a statement that begins, "Tomorrow, as the people of Ukraine mark their Independence Day, let it be clear. When Russia's senseless war began, Ukraine was a free country. Today, it is still a free country, and the war will end with Ukraine remaining a free, sovereign, and independent country. I spoke with President Zelensky today to affirm this message and to express America's unwavering support for the people of Ukraine." And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky posting on X, "Today history was made. The Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, made his first visit to Ukraine since our country's independence on the eve of our Independence Day. Today we reached an agreement on 4 documents between Ukraine and India covering the medical field, agricultural cooperation, humanitarian relations, and culture. Following the visit, we also agreed on a joint statement focusing on the development of a strategic partnership, bilateral trade, and continued military technical cooperation. India supports Ukraine's national sovereignty and territorial integrity, and this is critical because everyone in the world must equally respect the UN Charter." That was the post from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And finally, on Washington Today, what happens when the party is over? The cleanup begins. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago ended Thursday night after the speech by presidential nominee Kamala Harris, with a reported 100,000 balloons dropping from the roof of the United Center onto the delegates below. Today, Associated Press posted a video of what it called an army of crew members tasked with popping the balloons. $100,000 of them. If you missed any of the speeches from the Democratic National Convention or the Republican National Convention last month, or maybe you want to hear some of them again, you can find them all on C-SPAN's 2024 Campaign Trail podcast feed. That's at cspan.org or wherever you find your podcast. 2024 Campaign Trail is the feed. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Subscribe to C-SPAN's free evening newsletter Word for Word and get the stories making headlines in Washington sent to your inbox each day. Sign up at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night and weekend.